Late at night, across several cities in the Middle East, the sky suddenly lit up. Sirens began to echo across the streets. People ran for cover. Moments later, explosions followed. Missiles and drones streaked across the sky, striking cities and military targets across the region. What started as another exchange in a long-running conflict was quickly becoming something much larger. A war involving Iran, Israel, and powerful global allies. But the real question is not just who will win the next battle. The real question is something far more dangerous. What happens if this conflict spreads across the entire Middle East? Because in today's interconnected world, a war in this region does not stay here. It can ripple across global energy markets, disrupt international trade routes, and reshape the balance of power across the world. To understand why analysts are so concerned, we first need to understand how this war began to escalate. The conflict intensified after a series of coordinated military strikes. Israeli and allied forces targeted strategic locations inside Iran, including military facilities and infrastructure. In response, Iran launched waves of missiles and drones across the region. These attacks struck not only Israel, but also areas across the Gulf. Cities that had long considered themselves relatively safe suddenly found themselves under threat. The attacks shattered the perception that some Gulf states could remain isolated from the region's conflicts. This moment marked a turning point. Because once multiple countries begin experiencing direct attacks, a regional war becomes a real possibility. The Middle East is not a simple battlefield. It is a web of alliances, rivalries, and proxy conflicts. Iran has long supported armed groups and political allies across the region. Israel views many of these groups as existential threats. Meanwhile, the United States maintains military bases across the Gulf. And regional powers like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates are deeply connected to the balance of power. When conflict erupts between two major players in this region, other nations rarely stay uninvolved for long. This is what analysts call a chain reaction conflict. One event triggers another. A strike leads to retaliation. Retaliation leads to escalation. And suddenly, a regional confrontation begins to expand. Modern warfare in the Middle East has changed dramatically. Instead of massive ground invasions, conflicts increasingly rely on advanced technologies. Missiles capable of traveling hundreds or even thousands of kilometers. Drones that can fly low and evade radar systems. Precision-guided weapons targeting infrastructure. Iran has invested heavily in these asymmetric warfare capabilities. According to analysts, these tools allow Iran to challenge much larger military powers without relying solely on conventional forces. This strategy makes the conflict far more unpredictable, because attacks can occur suddenly and across vast distances. Cities, ports, military bases, and even shipping routes can all become targets. While missiles and drones capture headlines, the most dangerous battlefield may actually be a narrow stretch of water. The Strait of Hormuz. This narrow channel connects the Persian Gulf to the global ocean, and it is one of the most important energy routes on Earth. Roughly 20% of the world's oil supply travels through this single waterway. Every day, massive tankers pass through carrying energy from Gulf producers to the rest of the world. If this route were disrupted, the consequences could be enormous. In fact, recent tensions have already pushed oil prices sharply higher after threats to shipping routes. And that is exactly why this region matters far beyond the Middle East. When energy supplies are threatened, markets react instantly. Oil prices rise, shipping costs increase, insurance premiums surge. These economic shockwaves can spread across global markets within hours. In recent weeks, instability in the Gulf pushed crude oil prices above $100 per barrel, triggering fears of a broader energy crisis. And when oil becomes expensive, everything else becomes expensive too. Transportation, manufacturing, food production, electricity, energy is the foundation of the global economy. And when energy prices rise sharply, inflation spreads across the world. Behind the geopolitical strategies and economic calculations lies another reality: human lives. The war has already caused significant casualties across multiple countries. Early reports estimated more than 1,400 deaths in Iran, along with casualties in Israel, U.S. forces, and Gulf states. Cities have been damaged, infrastructure destroyed, families displaced, and humanitarian concerns continue to grow as the conflict spreads. These numbers remind us that war is never just about strategy or power. It is about people. For many Gulf countries, the conflict presents a difficult choice. Should they remain neutral, or should they openly align with one side? After Iranian missile strikes reached Gulf cities, governments across the region faced intense pressure to respond. But entering the conflict could dramatically escalate the war. It could transform a confrontation between two countries into a regional military coalition. And once that happens, the path toward de-escalation becomes far more complicated. The Middle East conflict does not exist in isolation. Global powers are deeply involved. The United States has long maintained military forces across the region. Israel remains one of Washington's closest allies. Meanwhile, countries like China and Russia are watching carefully, because the outcome of this conflict could reshape global geopolitics, energy markets, trade routes, and diplomatic alliances. In other words, the stakes extend far beyond the Middle East itself. Wars are not only measured in lives lost, they are also measured in economic cost. Within the first 100 hours of the conflict, analysts estimated that the United States alone spent more than $3.7 billion on military operations, and that figure does not include the broader economic consequences. Global energy price increases, shipping disruptions, insurance costs, supply chain instability. All of these factors add to the financial burden of conflict. Today, analysts believe the war has reached a critical turning point. Iran is attempting to increase the cost of continued military operations for its opponents. At the same time, its rivals are attempting to limit Tehran's military capabilities. This creates a dangerous balance, one where both sides are trying to avoid full-scale war, but also unwilling to back down. Experts describe the conflict as standing at a crossroads. One path leads toward escalation, the other toward negotiation. But predicting which path will be chosen is extremely difficult. The greatest fear among analysts is that the conflict could expand across multiple countries. Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, the Gulf states. Each of these regions contains armed groups and political alliances connected to the broader conflict. If fighting spreads into these areas, the Middle East could face one of its largest regional wars in decades, and the consequences would reach far beyond the battlefield. A prolonged war in the Middle East could reshape the global economy. Energy prices could remain elevated for months or even years. Trade routes could become more dangerous. Global inflation could rise, and economic growth could slow. For countries that depend heavily on imported energy, the consequences could be severe. Factories may reduce production, transportation costs could surge, consumers could face higher prices. In short, a regional war could trigger a global economic shock. For now, the world is watching closely. Diplomatic efforts continue behind closed doors. Military forces remain on high alert. Energy markets remain volatile. And millions of people across the region hope the conflict does not escalate further. Because history has shown that once wars reach a certain point, stopping them becomes much harder. The Middle East has always been a region of enormous geopolitical importance. It sits at the crossroads of continents. It controls some of the world's most important energy resources, and it contains some of the most complex political rivalries on Earth. Today, the conflict involving Iran, Israel, and regional powers has once again placed the region at the center of global attention. Because when tensions rise here, the entire world feels the impact. Energy markets react, global trade adjusts, and international diplomacy shifts. The next chapters of this conflict remain unwritten, but one thing is certain. What happens in the Middle East rarely stays in the Middle East, and sometimes the future of the global economy can depend on events unfolding in a single region of the world.